So welcome everybody. So nice to see such a big crowd. And so welcome to our WIZO Rachel Yaffa Zoom presentation. Everybody has been muted, as you can hear, for the duration of this talk. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and Dani will answer them after the talk. Before we hear from our special guest, Dani Wassner, here's a quick WIZO update. There's been a truly dramatic achievement for WIZO in promoting the rights of Israeli women in the workplace. WIZO's Equal Pay for Men and Women's Bill was passed into law on August the 24th. This bill is central to women's empowerment, which is one of the founding principles since WIZO's inception in 1920. And in another very historic moment for WIZO, Esther Moore, president of World WIZO, was invited to attend the historic Abraham Award signing ceremony of the peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain last Tuesday at the White House in Washington, D.C. That was a huge moment for WIZO. But on a more somber note, as Israel now faces a mandatory 3 weeks lockdown due to the upsurge in COVID-19 infections, many families continue to face hardships, and we expect to see a myriad of associated problems. As with the first lockdown, the most immediate and dramatic result is a huge loss of revenue. But despite the WIZO offices having to remain closed and only the most essential services being allowed to operate, WIZO continues to rise to the challenge of finding solutions to alleviate hardship in any way it can. And now, to our friend and guest speaker, Dani Wassner. Dani, who is the lovely son of longtime WIZO member Marion Spiro, was born in Sydney and educated in Sydney, where he was an active member of the Jewish community, serving frequently as a lecturer and communal spokesperson on issues related to both Israel and the Jewish people. With degrees in political science, history, and law, Dani made Aliyah in 1995 and has since worked in Israeli legal practices and has also led the effort to encourage foreign business people to invest in Israeli companies. Today, he lives in the city of Bet Shemesh with his lovely wife, Danielle, and his 4 gorgeous children. We are all so looking forward to hearing your points of view, Dani. So thanks again for making time for us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Bertha. It's good to be here. You know, my current position I've been in for the last 12 years or so, I work for the Jewish Federations of North America, which is the largest Jewish organization in America. It's kind of like, if I was to put it in Australian terms, it's the UAA, the JCA, and the Board of Deputies all rolled in one. It's a very, very big organization. And I'm the Director of Government Relations, which means that I essentially represent the North American Jewish community to the Israeli government. And as such, I frequently speak to North American audiences. So it's a pleasure to be here today and to be able to speak in my regular Australian accent and not have to put on an American accent here and there so they understand certain words that I'm saying. So that's a pleasure. And also to see so many familiar faces in the audience I wasn't expecting. So speaking of Australia, you know, back a long time ago in the 1950s, there was a delegation of Australian farmers that came over to Israel, and it was an agricultural exchange. The idea was for the Australian and the Israeli farmers to discuss agricultural practices, best practices, and learn from each other. And the very first meeting they held in the Ministry of Agriculture in Jerusalem, and they were sitting around discussing things, and after really just a few minutes, it became very clear, mainly to the Australian farmers, that the Israelis and the Australians came from very, very different worlds, and they had a very, very different perspective. And more than anything, the Australians realized the Israelis just couldn't grasp how big the Australians' properties were, how big their farms were compared to Israeli ones. So finally, one of the Australians says to Israeli counterpart, he said, listen, let me try and explain to you like this. If I get in my car in the morning on my farm and I start driving, and I drive, by the end of the day, I still won't have reached the edge of my property. And the Israeli farmer looks back at him and says, I also had a car like that once. This is one of the disadvantages of Zoom. I can't see if anybody's smiling or not, but anyway. And the truth is that Israel and Australia are very, very far away. And I think that's even more acute at the moment when nobody can visit. And I think people in America and Australia are feeling very, very distant from Israel, especially people who have tended to visit quite frequently or really know what's going on. Not only that, but this time everybody, understandably, is very focused on what's going on in their own countries. There's so much going on with COVID that it's very, very difficult to sort of keep track of what's going on around the world. So Bertha very kindly asked me to try and give you a bit of an overview of what's going on in Israel, what's been going on the last year or so, where things are at, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's start with politics, which probably is always the ugly, but let's try and have a look at what's going on, because we all know that Israel has been a big mess for a very long time, politically speaking, and in terms of having a stable government. We've had 3 elections. Most of it, understandably, is centered around one person, and that's Prime Minister Netanyahu, who in Israel is a very polarizing figure. The country's almost split down the middle between those who absolutely adore Netanyahu. He can't do a thing wrong. He's the best thing since sliced bread and everything else. And those who detest him, who hate him, everything else. There are very, very few people in the middle. And I think it's worth spending a minute to look at the reasons why both of those sides have that view, because I think it says a lot about what's going on in Israel at the moment. Now, of course, Netanyahu is, many people may know, in May of this year, he became the longest serving Israeli prime minister. He overtook David Ben-Gurion. So his legacy is already there. There are many things that Israelis, those particularly who admire him, really like about Netanyahu. First of all, let's start with the economy. Netanyahu has completely restructured the economy. Israel is now a member of the OECD. There was a headline, I believe was in Time magazine just a few days ago, about COVID, and it said, the headline was, Israel, the first rich country in the world to enter a second lockdown. I realized, I guess they don't consider Victoria to be a rich country, but I think Victoria's also entered a second lockdown. But the point is, it struck me that 10, 15, certainly 20, 30 years ago, nobody, not Time magazine, not anybody else would have described Israel as a rich country. But today, Israel is up there with the other developed economies of the world. And a lot of that is due to the efforts of Netanyahu. He's really focused on building the foundations of very, very steady economy. And when the world economy has taken hits like in 2008, and of course more recently what's going on now in the last 6 months, despite Israel also taking a hit, because the economy has a very strong foundation, Israel's been able to weather this storm. And as I said, so Netanyahu receives a lot of credit for that. The next thing we have to look at is the international statesman, Netanyahu. Netanyahu has met with President Trump more than any other world leader, and he's also met with President Putin of Russia more than any other world leader. Around the world, Netanyahu is often hailed. People saw, I think about 3 years ago, when Netanyahu was visiting India, there were scenes of tens of thousands of Indians, not Jewish of course, on the sides of the streets screaming, "Bi, bi, bi, bi." And there were similar scenes in Brazil about 2 years ago. There's the new relations in the Persian Gulf and with other Arab nations, excellent relations in Asia, particularly importantly as well in Africa and Latin America, new relationships, and in Eastern Europe. We know there's now embassies in Jerusalem, something we didn't dream of just 3-4 years ago. And Israel's also built new alliances. For example, there's a very important alliance between Greece, Cyprus, and Israel that works diplomatically, politically, economically, and many other things like that. And then we have Netanyahu, the media star, which we all know about, not only on CNN, but making speeches in the UN, in front of Congress in America and many other places. Here's the thing, when Israelis see that, when an Israeli citizen sees Netanyahu making a speech in Congress, one of the thoughts that's going through their head is, there is no other Israeli leader who could do this. And that's one of the secrets to Netanyahu's success. They know nobody is going to come close. And that's why something incredible happens before every election. You would expect there's no way any leader would take a trip overseas before an election where they should be campaigning every minute of every day. The last 4 or 5 elections, before every single one, Netanyahu has had trips to the United States and to other countries. 3 days before the last election, Netanyahu was in Russia. Why was he not campaigning? Because Netanyahu knows that when Israeli citizens watch TV and they see Bibi the statesman up there in front of Congress giving a speech, that's the best sort of campaign that Netanyahu can run, and he does it every time. In terms of the Palestinians, a lot of Israelis are appreciative that the claims that the Palestinians make, the concessions they want Israel to make, have been kept at bay, basically, for the entire Netanyahu term, for better or for worse. Finally, I'll just mention security. Netanyahu is often known as Mr. Security. And there's no doubt that the years of his being prime minister have seen a dramatic drop in armed events in Israel. In fact, we've had some years where there have not been a single Israeli death by terrorism or war, and that's never happened before under any other prime minister. And despite his strongman reputation, in fact, Netanyahu's relatively averse to any sort of armed conflict. And when things have heated up in Gaza in the past, Netanyahu has refrained from sending in troops. He's very, very cautious. But having said all that, as I said, 50% of the country, no other words, hates his guts. You only have to look what's going on at the moment. Almost every night, there are massive protests against Netanyahu in the streets. Very, very big. If nothing else, he's been in power too long, many would argue. There's the old saying that a government is like a shirt. If you don't change it every few days or every few years, it starts to smell. And that's what's happened. And there are corruption issues. And Netanyahu has been indicted. He's facing trials on a number of issues. And if he's convicted, not only will he have to give up the prime ministership, there is a reasonable chance he will end up going to jail. And it's not the first time that that's happened. We've had former Prime Minister Olmert served time in jail, former President Katsav. In fact, I remember they were in jail at the same time, and a few years ago it was Yom Ha'atzmaut, and the joke was when they had the Yom Ha'atzmaut ceremony in the prison, they began like they ought to please stand for the Prime Minister and the President in the prison. But it's very unfortunate. Right? But there is a chance that could be where Netanyahu. Having said that, he's a very clever person and a very smart legal and political player, and he may well avoid this, and we'll see what happens with the trial. It will be a long time. The trial will be a long time. Another thing worth mentioning is that Netanyahu's inner circle is always changing. That his closest advisors are always leaving and new ones being appointed, and that's often not a good sign of a person's character and perhaps even their policies. And the final thing I'll say in this sense is a lot of people are very concerned that Netanyahu and people in his Likud party are what they would say is trampling on the Supreme Court and on the whole justice movement in Israel. Netanyahu and many members of Likud have tried to pass certain laws that will diminish the power of the Supreme Court and increase the power of the Knesset and the executive branch. And a lot of people in Israel are very, very concerned. So because of all of that, I say that because it gives you a good background about where Israel's kind of is at the moment, and also why people feel they do about the current government and about Netanyahu. But because of that, we've had a stalemate. I'm not going to go into what really happened in the last 3 elections. If people are very interested, we could do that during Q&A. But we all know it was a big mess, and we never had a stable government. And even though now we finally do have a government, nobody would call it a stable one. It's a very shaky government. It was built on a very complicated coalition agreement, essentially between Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, who was the leader of the Blue and White Party, which the two parties were sort of neck and neck, or the two blocs were neck and neck in all 3 elections. And they had this complicated agreement. And part of that agreement is that in November 2021, just under a year away, Netanyahu will step down from the office of Prime Minister and Benny Gantz will become Prime Minister. Now, the agreement has all sorts of safeguards in it to ensure that Gantz will become Prime Minister in 2021. Despite that, there are many people in Israel that believe that Netanyahu always has another political trick up his sleeve and something will happen to allow him to avoid giving up the Prime Ministership and to stop Gantz becoming Prime Minister in 2021. In the meantime, Gantz is this special position that was created called alternate Prime Minister. Somewhat similar to the vice president in America. It comes with a lot of prestige and so things like an official residence and that sort of thing. And in theory, Netanyahu and Gantz will swap places in just under a year. But since the new government is formed, a few things have happened. First of all, Netanyahu's popularity has slightly decreased. Gantz's popularity has dramatically decreased. And it's worth spending 2 minutes on somebody else, Naftali Bennett, because his popularity has shot way up. In fact, he's polling second to Netanyahu at the moment, which is unheard of for somebody like Bennett, who is not the leader of a more centrist or left-wing party than Likud, but in fact a party that is more to the right than Likud. Now, a lot of this has to do with Bennett himself. He's seen as a very successful person. Interestingly, he's the son of American immigrants. He had American citizenship. He has almost fluent English. He's not a Netanyahu speaker, but he's a very good speaker and has very, very good English. He's a very, very successful high-tech entrepreneur who had a successful exit and made his millions in high-tech. And he's seen as, he had a very successful army career. He was a decorated soldier. And he's seen as a real go-getter. And even though he was on the right, and even though he always supported Netanyahu, in the current government, he was left out. So he's something of an opposition figure. And throughout the entire COVID crisis, he's been on TV almost every day in Israel, speaking up what the government should be doing, what the government's not doing, and his popularity just continues to rise as a result. So he's certainly somebody to look out for. And, you know, if I was a betting person, if anybody else would become prime minister after Netanyahu, Bennett is the most likely candidate, at least at this stage. But I mentioned, of course, Corona, and how can we talk about what's going on in Israel without talking about COVID-19? So very early on, back in, I guess, early March, Israel was one of the first countries in the world to enter into a very strict lockdown. Weeks and weeks before Australia, quite a bit before much of Europe, America, and the Israeli government was praised around the world. They seemed to have beaten the virus. Had small numbers of cases, very, very small number of deaths, and everything looked to be great. And Israel started to reopen. But it's quite clear that Israel reopened way too quickly. And probably the biggest problem was reopening schools, because schools ended up being a hothouse for this virus in Israel. And the entire country and population just simply became too complacent. Nobody really knows what caused anything, but it seems that this complacency was a real problem. In July, cases started to go back up, and they plateaued at what for Australia would seem an extremely large number. They plateaued at about 1,800 new cases a day. That was sort of during August. But now in September, the numbers have skyrocketed again, around 4,000 new cases a day. And it pains me to say that today we reached a new record of 7,000 new cases. Now, this is all very bad. The good news is that the death toll has remained relatively low. I don't want to say that, I mean, the number's large. It's 1,100 Israelis have died from COVID. But on a per capita basis, and certainly on a per case basis, this is extremely low compared to the rest of the Western world. So that's a silver lining, but clearly Israel's in a very, very bad situation now when it comes to COVID. And as a result, and as I think Bertha mentioned at the beginning, we've now entered into a new lockdown. On Erev Rosh Hashanah at 2 p.m., the country ended what for now a 3-week lockdown. That includes a limit. People are not permitted to go more than 1 kilometer from their house, except for essential reasons. All schools are closed. All stores are closed, other than pharmacies and supermarkets and 1 or 2 other things deemed essential services. I'm just checking people can still see me because I can see Bertha seems to have frozen. And, can people see me? Can nod or say yes or?
Yes, we can see you.
Thank you.
Yep.
It's just Bertha who's frozen. So the lockdown is in place, but once again, Israelis seem to be complying with it much less than happened the first time. I should also add all weddings and restaurants and everything is really closed. I'm not sure it's quite at the Victorian level, but it's not too far behind in theory. I've heard it said that Israel generally is very good on short-term emergencies. God forbid a war breaks out, Israel rallies around, the population rallies around, does everything that's needed. And that happened at the beginning of COVID. When we move into the medium or long term, the population becomes less compliant. And at the moment, the situation is very, very serious. And there has been talk by some hospitals that they're nearing saturation point, that it really could be a problem, especially as we approach in Israel the beginning of the winter. Although it's 35 degrees today, so winter, I guess, is quite far away still, but it's a real concern. It's also worth mentioning that there are 2 large population groups that have been hit much, much harder than the general population. And that's the ultra-Orthodox Haredi population and the Arab population. In degrees of magnitude, those two populations have had the vast majority of cases. There are a number of reasons and theories why this is the case. One is both of these populations tend to have even lower compliance levels and trust in the authorities than the general population. That's one reason. Another thing is certain cultural issues associated with both of those populations. For example, both of those populations are very big into having large weddings in the middle of the summer, outdoor weddings, and that was probably a spreader. Things like gathering in synagogues and yeshivot in often crowded conditions is obviously a problem. And perhaps above all, both of these populations tend to have large families living in very small accommodations. Which leads to crowding and an atmosphere where the virus spreads very easily. It's not uncommon to have, a family with 8, 10 children living in a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment. And you can imagine there's no possibility there of anybody in the family isolating. And that apartment itself is in an apartment building with lots of apartments. Similarly, with everybody playing together in a small communal area, it's a real problem. And we know across the world that groups of lower socioeconomic levels tend to be hit harder by the virus, and that's certainly the case with the ultra-Orthodox and Arab populations. And of course, all of this has taken a heavy toll on the government and on Netanyahu's popularity. Despite, at the beginning, people had this view that Netanyahu, was the guy with his hands on the steering wheel, the helm, and really beating this, and now the opposite is true. And the country is concerned. And there's talk now of an even harsher shutdown in the coming days, including closing synagogues for Yom Kippur. Just say a word about shul for a minute. Shuls have remained open, but with very limited, with very strict rules, limited capacity, limited number of people. Most people since Pesach time, before Pesach, have been having shuls outside. On my street here, there are 3 different minyanim in the street or in gardens. They've become almost semi-permanent. Chairs set up. We're lucky in Israel, at least over the summer, there is 0 rain, so we're out there, and I thank Kaddish at the moment, and every day, 3 times a day, outside in my neighbor's garden, we have 20, 30 people there every day. So that's how shuls are working, including on Rosh Hashanah. Because of the heat, we started at 6:30 a.m. and we were done by 10 a.m. But everybody could come, so we didn't need to restrict people. So the final thing I'll talk about before we open to Q&A, I'll say a few words about security and diplomacy. In my role, I attend once a quarter, I attend a meeting at the Prime Minister's office for heads of Jewish organizations or the representatives in Israel. And it's a meeting where we're briefed on the latest security diplomatic news. And every meeting that I can recall for the last few years, we've discussed whatever issues are going on at the moment. And then at the end of the meeting, one of the Prime Minister's senior advisors sort of steps forward and says, and let me remind you, he says every single time, he says, despite all the different topics we've been discussing today, the number one issue that occupies the Prime Minister's time and his concerns is Iran. Even though we haven't spoken about it, that is the number one issue. Because almost everything to do with Iran is done on the quiet. We don't hear a lot about it. We don't speak a lot about it. But Iran remains by far the most significant strategic threat to Israel, especially the thought of Iran with nuclear weapons. And it's not only nuclear weapons, it's Iran spreading its tentacles, so to speak, around the world, particularly on Israel's borders in Syria and in Lebanon, and also through Hamas in Gaza. So this is a really, really significant strategic threat to Israel. And I have no doubt that whatever end up happening with Netanyahu, if we hear him interviewed in 20 years' time and he's asked what is his most significant achievement during his time as Prime Minister, he will say then it was holding Iran at bay. And everything that the government does diplomatically, security-wise, is all focused on Iran, even though we don't talk about it. Having said that, there's a lot more going on. Nobody likes to talk about Donald Trump because he's so polarizing, because so much about everything he says and does is uncomfortable, is everything else. But the old saying that even a broken clock gets it right twice a day, on Israel, I think most Israelis at least agree, Trump is is the best thing we've ever seen. And again, I'm just talking about his policy in Israel, and many Israelis very much dislike him and very much dislike so much about Trump. But on Israel, from our perspective, he seems to be getting it right. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem, something that every president had promised for decades and nobody did. He recognized the Golan Heights. The Trump administration has had Israel's back at the UN and in international forums. He was the first president first administration to state that settlements are not illegal under international law. That was always a contested issue. I remember learning at the University of New South Wales, we did a course about whether settlements were legal or not. And it's a debate in international law. And for the first time under the Trump administration, they've said they hold that they're not illegal. And of course, there's been the peace plan and the last week's signing on the White House lawn of treaties with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. This is a very different piece, what we've seen before, many, many years ago, with Jordan and Egypt. With Jordan and Egypt, it was really a peace treaty because we fought wars with them. Our soldiers had clashed. We haven't had that with UAE and Bahrain. But on the other hand, Jordan and Egypt, until this day, it's a very cold peace. There are no Jordanians and Egyptians wandering around the beach in Tel Aviv or exploring Jerusalem. There are no Israelis in Jordan and Egypt. And there's almost no trade. The truth is they have very little they produce that we're interested in buying, and vice versa. They're essentially a third world country, and Israel's a first world country. United Arab Emirates and Bahrain is a different story. And already today, every day, you look in the financial papers in Israel, there's a story every day about a new deal between an Israeli company and an Emirati company or Bahraini company. Just last week, the chairman of Bank Hapoalim, Israel's largest bank, rang the opening bell in the Dubai Stock Exchange. These are things that are unbelievable. There are deals announced all the time. Israelis are busy online looking at the best hotels in Dubai and the best resorts and that sort of thing. It seems like it will be a really positive and a real peace. And we believe there's more to come. We believe there's more countries out there, including possibly the grand prize of Saudi Arabia, which is obviously the biggest and most important country in the region. Saudi Arabia has already started murmurings and suggestions of opening things up. And from our perspective as Australians, it wasn't noted much, but Saudi Arabia has announced that Israeli flights can now fly over Saudi Arabian airspace. So in the immediate term, that means that flights between Israel and Bangkok and Hong Kong, which is the route that so many of us take when we fly between Israel and Australia, that was probably going to be shortened by around 4 hours. So as soon as flights get back going, I think that's an immediate benefit that we should see. And in a more medium term, the chances of a direct flight between Israel and Australia increase dramatically. And I understand it would only be something like a 15, 16-hour direct flight at this point, now that El Al would be able to fly over Saudi. In terms of the Palestinians are in a very difficult position at the moment. They have no relations. They've cut off relations with the Trump administration. They're angry with the UAE. When Egypt made peace with Israel back in the 1970s, the Arab League not only condemned the peace treaty, but they threw Egypt out. This time around, the Arab League would not even condemn the treaty. They backed the United Arab Emirates. Palestinians, for them, sadly, are a lone voice at the moment, and they're in a very difficult position, which, of course, in many respects, is good for Israel because there's no pressure on Israel to make compromises with the Palestinians, compromises that could, in theory, threaten Israeli security. Of course, it also pushes off some sort of eventual peace with the Palestinians. But for now, Israel is in a very strong position in that respect. I'll just say about Gaza. Gaza is not a strategic threat to Israel, but it's a significant irritant. Every few months, there are rockets. We've all experienced them a few years ago. They were on all of Israel, not just in the south. My whole family slept in our shelter. My kids still talk about it. It was a significant event. And it's a major irritant, but it's not a strategic threat. And it's likely that it will continue to be like that for many years. Spark-ups every now and then without turning to anything major. And finally, Lebanon, Syria is kind of similar. Hezbollah has a potential to be a big threat. Israel is constantly, not officially, but everybody knows it's Israel is hitting targets of Hezbollah and Iran in Syria. But again, that area of the world is a mess as well and is not a strategic threat at this point. Israel. So just before I open to the sort of questions, and there are many other issues we could discuss, then you're welcome to speak about, whether it's religion and state, why we had 3 elections, anything else. I would just say that Israel's facing a very, very significant crisis at the moment with COVID. It's very, very serious. Having said that, everything else, there's a fairly rosy picture. No matter what you think of the current government or whether there's a different government, Israel's in a strong place militarily, diplomatically, economically, and that's all good. And if we can get through the next, hopefully just a few months until there's a vaccine or whatever else happens, Israel's in a very strong position at the moment, and it's here. So I'm happy to open to questions or anything else.
Dani, I would like to ask you a question. Malka Leifer, do you get a lot in your press about it? We do in Australia, obviously, because we have a vested interest. But what's the story in Israel?
Right. No, so that is a good question, and I presume most people saw that the court has ordered just yesterday, the day before, has ordered her extradition to Australia. That's still subject. She can appeal to the Supreme Court, and I'm sure she will. But from what I can see from the court decision, it's very unlikely that there's any reason for the Supreme Court to overturn that decision, which means that she will be extradited. The English-speaking press in Israel, the Jerusalem Post, etc., covers the story a lot, very heavily. The Hebrew-speaking press, less so, but it's absolutely out there. I get major Hebrew news alerts on my phone, and when the decision came down yesterday, it was there. It's a fairly big story. And I think most Israelis are fairly embarrassed by the delay, but also people have to understand that there is a system here. There is, I saw Australians writing letters to the Prime Minister or whatever saying, how could you do this? But like in Australia, the Prime Minister has no influence over a court decision. And wherever politicians have been able to do things like push the police to get private investigators to investigate her and things like that, they have done it. And particularly the justice ministers have been very onto this case, but justice moves slowly, especially in Israel with a clogged court system. But I believe it.
Okay, so I see there is a question from Antonia Milner. What do you think Israel's relationship will be like with USA if Biden wins the election?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Israel, for many, many years, forever, was always considered a bipartisan issue in America. Whether you were Democrat or Republican, everybody supported Israel, and it was wonderful for Israel. There have been cracks in that in the last few years for a few reasons. On the one hand, the Republicans, especially under Trump, have become passionately pro-Israel, and that's a lot due to the fundamentalist Christian, evangelical Christian population in America, which is strongly pro-Israel and strongly Republican. And on the other hand, on the Democratic side, the sort of far further left of the Democratic side has become, in many cases, much more anti-Israel. But the majority of the Democratic Party and certainly the wing led by Biden, the centrist wing, is certainly still very, very committed to Israel. There's no doubt to me that if Biden wins, we're not going to see the kind of love and amazing times we've seen under Trump. But we'll go back to what we saw before. I don't think it'll be very different to Clinton or the Bushes. You could say perhaps Obama was a little bit the anti-Trump. Everybody else, Clinton, the Bushes, Reagan, they were like, they were here. Obama went a little bit there, and Trump's gone a little bit there. Biden will be back to where we're used to. So it won't be a bad thing, but we won't necessarily see the great things we've seen from Israel's perspective under Trump.
Right. There's a question from Barbie. Do Israel and Australia cooperate on agriculture?
Well, I started off with that story from the 1950s, which is probably not true. But Israel once had a very strong agriculture sector. It's a very small, a tiny percentage of the economy these days. But it's there. I don't know of specific cooperation with Australia. Australia and Israeli agriculture and everything in that sphere is very, very different. Israel does cooperate with Australia economically on all sorts of levels, and I'm sure there is a level of agricultural cooperation, but I don't know anything specific.
Right. So Ronnie Bogner says, do you think that the large group of regular protesters have helped spread the virus?
This is a huge debate in Israel. When all the original rules came down, all the sort of lockdown rules and restrictions against gathering, there was a specific exclusion put for political protest. I think a lot of people felt that Israel is a democracy, and the right to protest was a fundamental right that could not be impinged. And so far that has stayed there. So even though you can't have groups of more than whatever it is in certain places, protesters are allowed to protest. On the one hand, they're outdoors, so the risk of infection is much lower. On the other hand, they seem to be, from pictures I've seen, close together and large crowds, and there's a lot of debate. And we're hearing every day, whenever there's talk of closing synagogues, and people saying, well, how can you close synagogues and yet allow protests? The people who go to one don't tend to go to the other, more or less, not exclusively. So there's a big debate at the moment, and actually currently the big debate going on today as we speak in the cabinet is probably a deal which is going to see indoor synagogues closed on Yom Kippur in exchange for protests being stopped for whatever it is, certainly in large groups. So yeah, it's a big debate in Israel.
There's a question from Evie, asks, how is Israel going with developing a COVID vaccine?
Thanks. Evie. So it's a good question. Israel is one of the countries in the world that has made significant progress to developing a vaccine. As far as I know, the 5 big front runners for an international vaccine does not include the Israeli company, or it's an Israeli the research institute. They've only just started human trials, the Israeli outfit, but other companies are already in stage 3 trials, so they're ahead. But my understanding is, and I'm certainly not a scientist, that it's important to keep trying to develop all these vaccines, because if one fails or one doesn't do a good enough job, then we have others as a backup. So Israel's out there in the front pack, but it's not going to be the first to develop a vaccine.
Okay, so Antonia Milner says, what can you tell us about Israel's pivot to South Asia, and in particular the relationship with India and China?
So let's start with China. The relationship with China is very complicated. Israel has built much stronger relations with China in recent years. It's been very important. Obviously, China is a huge market, a huge international player. But at the same time, our best friend in the world is the United States, and it's still by far the strongest country in the world. And it's not only our best friend, but it's the most important friend to have. And when tensions are high between China and America, Israel will always choose America. And that's happened on a number of occasions recently. When America has, for example, China wanted to bid on building a port in Israel, and America vetoed that because America wanted to visit the port. I shouldn't say America vetoed. America requested that Israel does not let China build the port, and Israel accepted that. So while the relations are increasing with China, there's often a holdback from the United States. India is a different story. India is getting closer and closer relationships with Israel in trade, particularly trade in military hardware, and all sorts of other areas. And there's no US problem there, so that is increasing significantly. And there's also, of course, in Southeast Asia that we have Indonesia and Malaysia, and there are indications that if relations with the rest of the Muslim world improve, that Israel will begin to have stronger relations with those countries.
Right. Then Diane Simon says, Rolene spoke about an instant airport test, instant COVID test to start opening airports. Can you comment on that?
I don't know too much about it. I've read a little bit, and I think it's not just in Israel. The idea is in order to sort of open the skies and open international travel, one of the ways to do it is if you have an instant COVID test, then anybody arriving can have that test. The sad truth is that cases are so high in Israel that the importance or the significance of somebody arriving from overseas with COVID is not particularly significant these days. If we're having thousands of new cases in Israel every day, who cares if one extra guy gets off the plane from New York and has COVID? And things are opening up in terms of international travel here. Australia is actually a list on the fairly long list now of green countries, where if you arrive to Israel from Australia, you no longer have to go into any sort of quarantine. Of course, you have to be able to leave Australia, and I understand Australia is the only country in the world that is restricting people from leaving. But that's another story. But for many other countries, you can come. Israelis can go. There are a few close countries like Greece, and we can go there freely and travel and vacation there and come back.
Yeah. Okay. Stan has a question.
So Dani, I wanted to talk to you about sovereignty or annexation of the Jordan Valley and other parts of Judea and Samaria. Were Israelis disappointed that that was shelved in making peace with UAE and Bahrain? And what do you think the prospects are of Netanyahu at doing that before he stops being prime minister?
So those are excellent questions. At first, when America made the announcement about this peace agreement or peace proposal, Israelis were ecstatic that essentially they were going to be allowed to annex certain areas of the West Bank. And I should make this clear, these are areas that are inhabited almost entirely by Israeli citizens, not by Palestinians. So in that respect, it wouldn't really have affected in any way the day-to-day life of Palestinians, but would have made the situation for Israelis much more secure. And Israelis were very happy about that. As other events took over, it kind of started to take more of a back seat, that issue. And when the announcement came that there was peace with the UAE, and this was the quid pro quo, there was an element of disappointment, and there still is an element that maybe an opportunity was missed. Having said that, officially, it was not in the agreement. It was announced and people said that it was not in the agreement. There is nothing that we could say, there's nothing that we'd say that in theory stops Israel from going ahead with the sovereignty, with applying sovereignty to these areas. What I think really happened is this. The Americans who originally said this and announced this got cold feet. And it became clear Jared Kushner and others got cold feet about annexation and about the effect it would have around the world. And they wanted to backpedal. And this was a way of them getting something in return. So even if there had not been peace with the UAE, it probably wouldn't have happened because the Americans decided they weren't really in favor. At this point, it's been raised, it's out there. The chances of it happening in the future are higher than they once were. But many believe, yes, it was a lost opportunity to take place.
Kitty Hammerman asks, what is the likelihood of a Palestinian state? And if so, what would it look like?
Well, on the one hand, some people would say there already is a Palestinian state that exists in what is today Jordan. Jordan has a vast majority of its population is Palestinian. The land it sits on is traditionally what's called Palestine. But of course, that's not what most people are talking about, and that's not the aspirations of the Palestinian people today. At this stage, as I kind of mentioned, the Palestinians are not in a good place. They have an elderly leader who's completely ineffective. There's no standout successor who will be any different. They have no relations with the Americans. They have very poor relations with us. They're getting more and more poor relations with the rest of the Arab world. They're in a very, very weak position. Sometimes at such a point, sometimes that can actually be an opening for something to happen. At the time when you least expect it. And Israel may want to take advantage, so to speak, in negotiations of the Palestinians being in such a weak position to try and offer a deal now. But every indication is that Palestinians would not accept the deal. There have been so many deals on the table for so many years, and the famous line that the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. From everything I can see, that's likely to continue.
Are there any further questions? No further questions. Let's just see. So if there are no further questions, it's over to Dee.
Dani, it's my honor and pleasure to thank you for your thought-provoking, inspiring, informative talk this evening. It's wonderful that with today's technology, we can share your insights and your valuable experiences. Your explanation of the political situation was very clear. In fact, I think it's the first time I've ever come close to understanding Israeli politics. Your positive view is very encouraging and very reassuring regarding the position Israel's in today. We can see your mum, Marion, proudly watching and quelling. We see lots of other mums proudly saying, I remember that Dani and my kids were in the same class at school. Dani, please accept this high certificate, can you see it, as a small token of our appreciation. It reads, presented to Dani Wassner, thank you for being our guest speaker on Zoom and for sharing your in-depth knowledge of Jewish affairs. Dani, please use your imagination so you can hear the loud, rapturous applause everyone's giving you at the moment. We've never had so many questions. It's been amazing. While you're all using your imaginations, I hope you all enjoyed the delicious supper that our wonderful ladies on the committee of Rachel and Yaffa have made and prepared for you.
Can you email it to me?
Thanks, Lorna and Hagit. Without your help, tonight would never have happened. And a special thank you to you all for logging in and joining us tonight. As Bertha mentioned, the situation in Israel during the COVID lockdown is dire. And if anyone is in a position to be able to make a donation, please go online and bingo, we'll take your money with pleasure. Dani, once again, thank you so much. Toda rabah, Laila tov, everybody.